Hello, in this video I'm going to talk about variable fonts and in particular implementing variable fonts into HTML and CSS environments. In this example I'm going to show you a way or the way of using variable fonts in a CSS HTML implementation for a website, a very simple website that's just text-based. And we're going to look at how this will allow us to create richer typography in these environments. So I'm taking some text that I grabbed off of Wikipedia for René Descartes, the philosopher, and looking at a way of organizing this information in a way that is hierarchically rich or that is well organized for functionality purposes to create less ambiguity and better reading, and just seeing how we can use variable fonts to extrapolate the styles and the typographic devices that we have available to us in order to build more coherent and better reading typographic documents on the web. And of course this would also apply for any application that is non-static, so app designs as well as data on a screen. It might be data visualization on a screen. Variable fonts can be implemented in this way too, with the same kind of savings in file size, but extrapolation in styles and devices that we have available to us. So you see here, I've got a markup of the text, HTML, with the CSS, and I'm going to be discussing this area, these two areas, and how I'm working with them. But first of all, let's talk about what is a variable font. So variable fonts were announced in 2016, at least OpenType variable fonts, at ATypI Warsaw. And a really good way to explain what variable fonts are would be to use a quote by John Hudson, the type designer of T-Row Typeworks, where he described variable fonts as one font that behaves like many fonts. So we're used to typical static fonts where we have conventional selections of font weight, font width. So actually, if I go to a really good website by Lawrence Penny, it's going to load up here. This will actually show us a really good example of this, perhaps better for what I'm wanting to describe than vfonts at the second. But let's get this. Sorry for this. Okay. So for instance, I've got this typeface Zeitung here, and I'm used to having instances in a font, so extra light and thin in my font, and I've got weights, for example, that I can choose from throughout the family, and I can implement them. Now, what's the big barrier in a website? I can only have about 2 to 3 typefaces loaded and implemented on my web page, on a given web page, because I can only serve that many before the website bogs down and the performance isn't operating as well as I would like. Especially if I'm dealing with text-heavy websites and I've got a lot of image content in there. I don't want my font to be able to, I don't want my font, or fonts, plural, bogging down the performance, so I'm trying to reduce that. What a variable font does is it takes these conventional sensibilities or these conventionally available weights that are available, and it allows me to use axes and have availability to the entire design space, technically. And of course, in this typeface, Zeitung, I have available, I have the option of using optical size here as well. So this is a 2-axis variable font. So variable font, one file that behaves like many files. If I shrink this down a little bit, I'm going to go back over here. And I mean, some variable fonts they have weight variations, they have italic. Sorry. All right, we're going to move on from there. That's not working for some reason. Perhaps that should just load the page. Oh, it was working. Huh. Okay. But what's really important about variable fonts is that they allow me the ability to vary the typeface parameters. So when I'm implementing variable fonts, what I'm using is to speak to that weight or perhaps an optical size variable. I'm using font variation settings, which is a newer tag, as brackets is showing us here. It doesn't really recognize it, but it is an active tag or an active parameter that you can use in CSS, font variation settings. Now what's important here that you see is that I have to speak to the axis that we were looking at. So we were on axis praxis. And what's really important is, sorry, I'm just going to do something. What's really important here is when we were on axis praxis, what's going on with you, axis praxis? Hang on a sec. Sorry. We saw that this typeface has two axes. We would call this the weight axis of the font, so I can go from light to very bold. And I would call this the optical size axis of the font. Now, these axes have their own tags, which are registered by companies that are responsible for managing the OpenType spec, which would be companies like Microsoft, Adobe, Google. These collaborators are responsible for managing the specification. And in order for us to speak to a variable font property, like weight or optical size or width, perhaps, I have to enter that first define which axis I'm speaking to. So for instance, width would be WDTH. It's always a 4-letter tag. So OPSZ. If it's a custom tag, it might be something like, let's say, contrast. And it would be capital letters. But for this context, we're using weight because source variable fonts, by the way, I'm using source sans, so if I look inside my folder, I'm loading up fonts. Now, I'm using source sans and source serif variable fonts because, I mean, conventionally we're used to doing things like we'll go into the head of our website and we'll put a link to the Google font that we want to use, or the monotype font, or the Adobe type font. Sorry, typekit is no more. But we would put into the head of our website our link to the server, to the Google server, or to the whoever is serving the font, hosting it, and then I wouldn't have to speak to it this way. I would just start speaking to it in my CSS. In this case, what you'll find though is that a lot of the major providers, because variable fonts, even though they were announced 4 years ago, they're still very new. And the major serving platforms like Google Fonts, Adobe Fonts, Monotype, they don't really have a lot of options for us to choose from right now. So you probably find that going and testing out fonts like Source Sans and Source Serif from Adobe's GitHub repository for the fonts is a good option. There's also Adobe Variable Font Prototype, which has 3 axes, I believe: weight, width, if I'm correct, and optical size. Definitely width, weight, and optical size. So it's a font where you could try out using multiple variables or multiple axes in the same font. But what's really important is this is how I'm implementing it, and this integer that you see, the 780 and then the 650 in this tag, this is the axis value that I'm using to speak to the weight of the font in this case. So I could be speaking to optical size, it would be a different integer value. What's also very important is that these variables, you see that I've listed it here: source sans variable font italic, weight axis 200 to 900. So that is the range that the type designers have implemented into this font. So I can use integer values between 200 and 900. Now, how do you know what variable font, what value each different variable font might be using? That is a question where we would either have to have the type designer tell us what they've used, or what we're doing is we want the type designer to be following the specs that are being put out by those companies I mentioned who are managing the specification. So a weight axis for a variable font should technically, based on the specification for the format, exist between values 200 and 900, which it's compliant with what we understand as the typical font weight values we used to use to speak to static fonts, or that we use to speak to static fonts. Now, what we're seeing here is you see different values already. You see 1, 2, 3, and you see the same one, and then you see a 4th value, a 3rd value, or sorry, a 5th value. What that means is if I go into this website prototype, what I have going on here is if you look at the sidebar, I've got source sans, one typeface file, and I've got one very bold use here for the title, and then I've got a second use, which is lighter. It's the 650 instance that you see there on the weight axis, which is used for a subtitle to distinguish these elements. And then I see a regular spec, like perhaps this would be about the 350. It's a little bit lighter than regular, to give it a little bit of a lighter presence and a contrast from the subtitle. And then we also see that used here. So that's 3 styles, and this is a slightly lighter version of this bold one, so it's around, let's say, 450. So that's a 4th variation. Now we're already over what we would have in a static font load. That's 4 uses of that sans serif. Here's another use. This is 5. A little bit larger and a little bit lighter to be optimized for this size and working with the serif font. And if I go down even further, I've got uses here in the footnotes where I've got a slightly different weight specification that optimizes this sans serif to work better for the footnotes, which are larger, of course, than this type, but it needs to work in conjunction to contrast from the serif. So I've got a 6th variation. So already what we're seeing is we see double the amount of, let's say, styles than I would be able to get from static fonts. So what variable fonts represent for us, represent an opportunity for us to create richer typography in our web typographic implementations, because with 3 font files, and actually I've used 4 font files in this website, which I can do because if these variable fonts are a subset via WAF2 subsetting, I can get the font load down to under 150 kilobytes, which is what I'm aiming for, to have either 150 or lower. With these, let's say 3 fonts even, I've got an italic Roman, which is a separate font. I've got the Roman itself. I've got the sans serif. With 3 fonts, I've already created very rich, good hierarchy. It creates a more coherent typographic layout. So for instance, in the serif type, once again, there's a 7th use right there for the title. And what I see now here is a way to use in the serif variations, I can create separation in the document where I don't have to use italic, let's say, or I don't have to make this type smaller. I can have it more seamlessly blend into the layout, and although reduce and remove ambiguity of a confusion with the italic in between this by having just a very light usage of the serif typeface for pull quotes in the text. So already on this website I'm using 3 different fonts and I'm getting upwards of 12 different variations of weight in this case. I could have optical size variations in the same font, and then I would be multiplying my styles, creating better typography. The important thing for us to recognize is that we are actually creating better reading experiences for our user by having this kind of flexibility in our document. But so let's have a look at that. Now, I'm working with, let's go to the paragraph, and if I go into the paragraph markup, let's find that pull quote. Here it is, pull quote here, and I'll have a block quote tag. And you see here I've used weight 270. So what this allows me to do then in there is it allows me to make variations. So if I go to 200, that's the very extreme end of the weight variation, and it creates a very lightweight. If I was to change this, I could maybe go in the opposite direction. I could put 650. And if I go over here, you'll see that it gives me then a bolder instance point. So perhaps I want to go in the opposite direction. I want my pull quotes to be bolder, and that's how I would like it to stand out. It's a little abrupt, perhaps, but that might be the method that you're going with, and it works appropriately for your layout. What's important is that I had the ability to fine-tune this, so perhaps actually what would be nice is we can see it happening in real time. Sorry. Let's get this over here. Whoa. Okay. But you can watch the variations. I guess my older MacBook isn't so happy with this. You could create a subtle weight jump here as well, if that was what you were going for. I had it set up as a lighter one because I felt like it separated the text in a comfortable way, but really the point is you have the option to make this stylistic um, separation that creates a better reading experience. Now, within here, what we can also look at is within our CSS, I've set up this web page as well so that it has, of course, responsive functionality for different media sizes. So what you'll notice is that in the mobile screens, I've spoken to the paragraph text, and I've optimized it differently for different screen sizes. Because under different screen sizes, of course, we have different conditions and pressures. We might have the paragraph operating at a slightly different point size, perhaps, for the media size in the screen. But just in general, when my type gets used on a smaller screen device, perhaps it goes to iPad down to smartphone, and then, of course, to desktop, it's possible that I can create a better reading experience by optimizing that text paragraph in my paragraph settings. I could optimize all of my tags to work better at their use cases, so mobile screen as well as the tablet screen. And what you see here is that I've got the tablet at 300, which is a little bit lighter than 400. I've got my regular instance for the paragraph of text at 400. Let's exaggerate this a little bit, though. I want you to see the difference. So this would not be ideal, but I've got the desktop at 500. I've got the middle range, so the tablet's at 3, and I've got the mobile screen operating at 420. And so that's going to give me a slightly different one, a slightly different variation. So if I go into the page now, this is denser. If I flip down, so I'm going to snap over to the tablet size. This is about tablet size. And so I've got a lighter variation, which can optimize it, let's say, for reading on the iPad. And then if I snap it all the way down to my mobile size, then what you have here is a slightly darker weight, which perhaps reads better when it's being used on a smaller device, being held at a different distance from our face. Just different reading conditions that we can optimize for. And what's great about the variable font is it has the flexibility to do that for us. Okay, that's everything for this video. This is implementing and using variable fonts to create better typography in web situations, or what I might say is to create richer and more functional typographic layouts and hierarchies through using variable fonts. And in doing this, we've seen how do we implement variable fonts into our layouts and start tweaking it. So that's everything for this video, and I look forward to